From rocket launchers that could level an enemy line in seconds to submachine guns built in secret workshops, these are 7 of the most underrated weapons of World War II. 1. British sticky bomb, number 74 grenade. Britain, 1940. German tanks were rolling across Europe, and the British had almost nothing to stop them. So they created something absolutely insane. The number 74 anti-tank grenade, better known as the sticky bomb, was essentially a glass sphere filled with nitroglycerin wrapped in a cloth soaked in an incredibly tacky adhesive. Soldiers were expected to run up to tanks carrying explosive-filled glass balls covered in superglue. Here's how it worked. The grenade had a metal casing protecting the sticky surface. When the moment came, soldiers would rip off the safety cover, exposing the adhesive underneath. Then came the terrifying part. They either had to throw it or, more effectively, physically slap it onto the side of an enemy tank. Once attached, they had exactly 5 seconds before detonation. The technical specifications were surprisingly sophisticated for such a desperate weapon. The glass sphere design ensured the nitroglycerin would shatter on impact, maximizing damage. The adhesive was so powerful, it could stick to dusty, muddy, or even slightly wet surfaces. Britain produced around 2.5 million of these grenades, flooding the Home Guard and regular infantry units with them. But imagine how the soldiers felt about carrying a weapon that was just as likely to stick to them as it was to stick to the enemy. The adhesive was so strong that soldiers constantly reported accidental self-sticking incidents. Imagine you're in the heat of battle, adrenaline pumping, and suddenly this grenade adheres to your uniform sleeve. You've got 5 seconds. Training manuals actually had to include detailed instructions on how to remove accidentally stuck grenades from clothing and equipment without triggering detonation. But despite these dangers, the sticky bomb achieved remarkable success. The weapon was most effective against light armor and could disable critical components like tracks and engine compartments. When placed by hand with enough force, it could penetrate vulnerable spots that even dedicated anti-tank weapons struggled with. A South African infantry section once faced down 28 advancing German tanks armed primarily with these sticky bombs. These soldiers, knowing they were catastrophically outgunned, chose to stand their ground. They destroyed multiple tanks by running directly at armored vehicles, slapping these grenades onto hulls and diving for cover. The sticky bomb gave ill-equipped infantry a fighting chance. It was crude, dangerous, and absolutely terrifying to use. But it worked. 2. Panzerfaust. By 1943, German forces were facing waves of Allied tanks, and they needed something cheap, effective, and simple enough that any soldier could use it. Enter the Panzerfaust, the disposable, recoilless anti-tank launcher that would change infantry warfare forever. This weapon was beautifully simple. A steel tube, a shaped charge warhead, and a basic sight. That's it. No complicated mechanisms, no extensive training required. Point, shoot, throw away. The technical specifications were impressive for such a basic weapon. The Panzerfaust came in several versions, with calibers ranging from 60mm to 110mm. The shaped charge warhead could penetrate up to 200mm of armor, enough to punch through most Allied tanks of the period. The weapon weighed approximately 6 kilograms, light enough for one soldier to carry multiple units. But the effective range was only 30 to 60 meters. That meant German soldiers had to let enemy tanks get dangerously close before firing. In the final years of the war, as Germany desperately defended its cities, teenage Hitler Youth and early Volkssturm members found themselves in rubble-strewn streets, awaiting for Allied armor to roll within spitting distance before unleashing these weapons. The Panzerfaust's recoilless design meant there was no kickback, but it created a massive backblast behind the shooter. Soldiers had to ensure nothing was behind them or risk serious injury. In urban combat, this became a deadly calculation. Fire from a confined space and the backblast could kill you. fire from an exposed position, and enemy infantry could kill you. What made the Panzerfaust truly revolutionary was its production efficiency. Germany was being bombed around the clock, resources were scarce, and factory production was constantly disrupted. Yet they managed to produce millions of Panzerfausts because the weapon required minimal machining and could be assembled quickly with basic materials. Here's something you probably didn't know. The Panzerfaust design was so effective that it influenced anti-tank weapon development for decades after the war. The Soviet RPG series was inspired by the Panzerfaust. American disposable launchers, same story. This desperate German weapon became the template for modern infantry anti-tank warfare. In the final months of the war, as Berlin was encircled, Panzerfaust-wielding defenders turned the city into a nightmare for Soviet tank crews. Every corner, every pile of rubble could hide a soldier with a launcher. Tanks that had survived thousands of kilometers of warfare were destroyed in street battles by weapons that cost less than a rifle to produce. The Panzerfaust proved that technological sophistication isn't always necessary. Sometimes, effectiveness comes from brutal simplicity and ease of use. 3. Sten Gun. When you think of World War II submachine guns, you probably picture the Thompson, right? Now, let me tell you about its ugly, cheap British cousin that actually won the war. The Sten Gun looks like something assembled in a garage, and that's basically what it was. Designed for mass production during Britain's darkest hour, the Sten was built almost entirely from stamped metal parts requiring minimal machining. It fired 9 by 19mm parabellum rounds from a 32-round detachable box magazine at approximately 500 rounds per minute. The entire weapon weighed just 3.2 kilograms and could be produced for a fraction of the Thompson's cost. While the Thompson required skilled machinists and expensive materials, the Sten could be churned out in bicycle shops and small workshops across Britain. When you're staring down a potential German invasion, that difference matters more than accuracy or aesthetics. But here's what makes the Sten truly intriguing. In its early days, it was far from perfect. The magazine was unreliable. It could go off if dropped, and soldiers despised it. So how did this rough, accident-prone submachine gun end up becoming one of the most widely used weapons of the entire war? Well, 2 reasons: adaptability and accessibility. British engineers continuously refined the design based on battlefield feedback. More importantly, the Sten's simplicity meant it could be manufactured anywhere. In Nazi-occupied France, Denmark, or Poland, resistance fighters couldn't exactly order weapons through official channels, but they could get their hands on basic metal working tools and stolen ammunition. The Sten became the weapon of choice for guerrilla warfare across Europe because you didn't need a factory to make one. The Sten's 9mm parabellum caliber was actually strategically brilliant. German forces used the same ammunition in their MP-40 submachine guns and various pistols. Resistance fighters could scavenge enemy ammunition after ambushes, keeping their Stens supplied without relying on Allied airdrops. But there's a darker side to the Sten story that rarely gets told. Its a full auto-only design and high rate of fire meant ammunition disappeared quickly. In extended firefights, soldiers could burn through their entire ammunition supply in seconds. This led to a tactical doctrine of short, controlled bursts rather than sustained fire, a technique that required discipline under extreme pressure. Despite its crude appearance and early reliability issues, it became a symbol of resistance and liberation. When you see photographs of French resistance fighters during the liberation of Paris, many are carrying Stens. When Danish resistance fighters sabotaged German operations, they used Stens. When British commandos conducted raids across occupied Europe, Stens were slung over their shoulders. British and Commonwealth forces produced over 4 million Stens during the war. Resistance groups manufactured thousands more in secret workshops. While collectors obsess over pristine Thompsons and MP-40s, the Sten did more to liberate Europe than either of them. Number 4. Katyusha rocket launcher. The Katyusha multiple rocket launcher system was revolutionary, terrifying, and devastatingly effective. Mounted on ordinary trucks, these systems could unleash apocalyptic firepower and then disappear before counter-battery fire could respond. Katyushas typically featured 16 to 48 launch tubes loaded with 132mm rockets. Each rocket had an effective range of approximately 8.5 kilometers. The system could fire its entire payload within seconds, saturating a target area with explosions before enemy artillery could even calculate firing solutions. The tactical advantages were enormous. Traditional artillery required careful ranging, skilled crews, and precise calculations, but the Katyusha point in the general direction of the enemy and unleash hell. The rockets weren't particularly accurate individually, but when you're firing dozens simultaneously, accuracy becomes less important than sheer volume of explosive. Mobility was Katyusha's secret weapon, mounted on Studebaker or ZIS-6 trucks, supplied through Lend-Lease or Soviet production. The launchers could race into position, fire their devastating barrage, and retreat before German artillery observers could coordinate a response. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 demonstrated the Katyusha's strategic importance. Soviet forces used massed Katyusha batteries to disrupt German armored formations, destroy supply concentrations, and suppress enemy artillery. The Germans had nothing comparable in terms of mobile, rapid-fire artillery system. But here's the twist. The Katyusha wasn't actually a Soviet invention. It was based on pre-war research into rocket artillery that most nations had abandoned as impractical. The Soviets simply recognized that precision wasn't always necessary. Sometimes, overwhelming firepower delivered rapidly was more valuable than accurate, slow fire. The production efficiency was remarkable. Katyusha launchers were simple structures, basically metal rails welded to truck beds. The rockets themselves were relatively crude compared to German V weapons or Allied bombs, yet the system's effectiveness came from an operational doctrine, not technological sophistication. Soviet forces developed tactics specifically around Katyusha mobility. Units would receive coordinates, race to firing positions, unleash their rockets, and retreat within minutes. German forces would retaliate with counter-battery fire only to find empty fields. The Katyusha influenced post-war military doctrine worldwide. Multiple launch rocket systems became standard equipment for modern armies, from American M270 MLRS to Chinese Type 63. Every modern rocket artillery system owes something to Stalin's organ. 5. Smith Gun. The Smith Gun represents everything about Britain's Home Guard period. This improvised anti-tank weapon was a 3-inch smooth-bore gun mounted on a 2-wheeled carriage. It fired 3-inch shells, including anti-tank rounds, and weighed around 100 kilograms. It could be towed into position or, in a pinch, fired directly from the ground. It wasn't particularly powerful, it wasn't particularly accurate, but it was there, and when German tanks were potentially weeks away from rolling across English beaches, there was something. The technical limitations were significant. The smooth-bore design meant reduced accuracy and range compared to rifled guns. The carriage mounting was unstable, and recoil management was challenging. The ammunition selection was limited, and penetration capability was marginal against modern tank armor. But here's what makes the Smith gun fascinating from a historical perspective. Britain produced these weapons in relatively large numbers and distributed them to Home Guard units across the country. Why invest resources in clearly inferior weapons when those resources could have been used elsewhere? Well, the Smith gun wasn't really about stopping panzer divisions. It was about giving ordinary citizens the tools to resist, however inadequately. A factory worker or shopkeeper turned Home Guard volunteer couldn't effectively operate a sophisticated anti-tank gun, but they could learn to load, aim, and fire a Smith gun with minimal training. While it was inferior against heavy tanks, it could be effective against lighter armored vehicles, infantry concentrations, and fortified positions. In the event of invasion, German forces would have relied heavily on lighter vehicles for initial landings. A 3-inch shell from a Smith gun could absolutely wreck a half-track or armored car. The weapon's design allowed for rapid repositioning. The two-wheeled carriage could be towed by small vehicles or even manhandled by the crew. In defensive warfare, especially in Britain's hedgerow country and narrow village streets, mobility mattered more than firepower. The Smith gun was eventually phased out as Britain received better equipment through American Lend-Lease and British production ramped up. But during those critical months when invasion seemed imminent, these improvised guns stood guard across England. Number 6. Besa Machine Gun. The Besa Machine Gun, originally a Czechoslovak design, designated ZB-53, was licensed and produced by Britain for installation in tanks and armored vehicles. The Besa came in 7.92 by 57mm Mauser and later 15mm versions. It was belt-fed, air-cooled, and fired at approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute. These specifications sound unremarkable until you understand the context of armored vehicle weaponry during World War II. Tank-mounted machine guns faced unique challenges. They operated in confined spaces with limited cooling. They fired through small ports or coaxial mounts with restricted fields of fire. They needed to be maintainable by crew members without specialized tools, and they had to function reliably despite extreme vibration, temperature variations, and contamination. The Besa excelled at all of these requirements. British tanks like the Crusader, Valentine, and Churchill mounted Besas as their primary anti-infantry armament. While the tanks themselves often had mechanical issues, the Besa kept firing. And here's what made Besa special in practical terms. The air-cooled design meant one fewer system to maintain compared to water-cooled alternatives. The belt-fed mechanism was reliable even when covered in dust or mud. The weapon could be disassembled and reassembled inside a tank turret with basic tools. Most importantly, it just worked. But why did Britain adopt a Czechoslovak design chambered in German ammunition when they had their own machine gun designs? Well, this is because when Britain began its rearmament program in the late 1930s, they needed a tank machine gun immediately. Designing a new weapon from scratch would take years. The Czechoslovak ZB-53 had already proven itself reliable and was available for licensing. The fact that it used 7.92mm ammunition actually became an advantage. British forces could use captured German ammunition to feed their Besas, while German forces couldn't use captured British .303 ammunition in their weapons. The 15mm Besa variant deserves special mention. This heavy machine gun could engage light armored vehicles and aircraft, giving tanks additional defensive capability. The 15mm Besa could punch through the armor of German half-tracks and armored cars, making it valuable in mobile warfare where tanks encountered various enemy vehicles. After the war, many nations continued using the Besa in various applications. The design's simplicity and reliability made it attractive for countries building their military capabilities in a post-war period. British armored vehicles used Besas well into the 1950s and beyond. 7. Northover Projector. This smooth-bore black powder mortar was approximately 3 inches in caliber, weighed around 21 kilograms, and could fire black powder grenades or modified grenades to a range of roughly 100 yards. It was fired from a simple base plate and manually loaded. It was also possibly the worst weapon officially issued to any military force during World War II. But before we mock it too much, we need to understand the context. Britain in 1940 was in a genuinely desperate situation. The regular army had evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind most of its heavy equipment. German invasion seemed not just possible, but imminent. The Home Guard was being formed from volunteers who had virtually no military equipment. The Northover Project was created specifically for Home Guard units that had literally nothing else. Black powder was available because it was used in quarrying and mining. Grenades could be manufactured in small workshops. The projector itself was simple enough that local fabrication was possible. In a nation preparing for total resistance, you arm people with whatever you can produce. The technical limitations were severe. The 100-yard range meant home guard units would have to let enemy forces get dangerously close before engaging. The black powder propellant created massive smoke clouds that instantly revealed the firing position. The accuracy was appalling. The grenades were often unreliable. The weapon was difficult to aim and had no recoil system, meaning it had to be re-aimed after every shot. So, why did Britain actually issue thousands of these essentially useless weapons instead of saving the resources? Well, there are multiple reasons. First, let's consider the practical aspects. Against infantry in the open, even an inaccurate explosive projector could be effective. In ambush situations along roads or in villages, where engagement ranges would be short anyway, the Northover could potentially inflict casualties. Against light vehicles, a well-placed grenade could disable or destroy the target. More importantly, the weapon required no sophisticated ammunition. As the war progressed and Britain's industrial capacity increased, better weapons became available. But in 1940 to 41, during the critical period, the Northover could be produced using resources that wouldn't otherwise contribute to the war effort. Black powder that couldn't be refined into modern propellants could still fire Northover grenades. Machine shops that couldn't produce precision parts could still fabricate simple tubes and base plates. Here's the twist about the Northover that'll surprise you. It was never actually used in combat, at least not in any officially recorded engagement, because the German invasion never came, so we can't actually prove it was useless. Maybe it would have been devastatingly effective in the hands of determined defenders. We'll never know. The Northover projector represents the absolute extreme of wartime improvisation. It was created when Britain had its back against the wall, when conventional military thinking had to be abandoned in favor of arming the population with anything that could possibly resist invasion. These 7 weapons tell a story that history books often miss. So which of these 7 weapons surprised you the most? And which one would you have wanted if you were facing enemy tanks in 1944? Drop your answer in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to more forgotten history that shaped our world.